Good afternoon, everyone. This is Marie speaking here. I'm moderating the webinar of today. So welcome to the webinar on the European Electronic Communications Code, transposition. I will first start off with some housekeeping rules. So next slide, please. So for accessibility, you might have already noticed, so there is captioning provided, and you find the link in the chat box on the right-hand side. There is also sign language interpretation, which you should see in a separate window. And also you can already download the presentation if you prefer having it bigger or you want to already have a look. And that is on the right-hand side in the handouts section. There is only one document to download there. You also find additional information in the chat box. There is a link to the toolkit we are mentioning a lot today, and also to the recommendations. But this is more background information. So for the actual webinar now, I think the presentation is the most relevant one. For questions, you will notice that you are all muted, so there will be no oral questions, but we take questions via the question box on the right. So there you will see you can add questions and we will take them in chronological order as they come in. So we will not skip certain questions, so just so you know. Also, the questions will be anonymous. We will not say any names for privacy reasons because this webinar is recorded, as you know. And the chat box is reserved for mainly technical issues. So if you need support with anything, that would be in the chat box, just to distinguish the two. Also, if you are using GoToWebinar from a mobile device or from the phone, you know the procedure probably because you've done it. You have to download an app and type in the webinar ID. But the surface, the user surface might look a little different. So that's why if I say now on the right-hand side in the chat box, etc., I'm not sure if that is exactly the same from the phone. And as I said before, so the webinar is recorded and afterwards there will be a transcript and also the slides are available and you will have the subtitled webinar later for download on our website, and we will also send it to all those who have registered. So even those who maybe cannot join now, they will receive all the information. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of the content. We will first start with an overview of the current status of the communications code, which for short now we will just say the code because it's a long name. Then we will have in between the two presentations a short session of question and answers in which we will take only 3 questions. So just so you know, because we want to keep the main part of questions for later. And then in the second part of the presentations, we will actually go into detail of the recommendations for national advocacy and what you can do on national level. And then, as I said, in the end, there will be more time for question and answers. If we receive more questions than we have time to answer, because we are limited to 1 hour, we will follow up with you by email and we will answer your questions afterwards. Next slide, please. A general introduction, who is EDF? Most of you probably know, but we are the European Disability Forum with over 100 member organizations, and we represent around 100 million persons with disabilities in the EU, which means all kinds of different disabilities. And we are based in Brussels. And our main task is advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities and implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in the EU and the member states. And here you also have a picture of our executive committee, which you can see on the left side of the slide. Next slide, please. And our speakers for today, you have expert speakers from the EDF team. Alejandro Moledo is our EDF Policy Coordinator. He will start the first part of the webinar, and he will then be followed by Mher Hakobyan, our EDF Accessibility Officer, who will take over on the second half. And me, I'm Marie Denninghaus. I am also EDF Policy Coordinator. I am going to be moderating, also taking the questions for later. I think that was it. I hand over to Alejandro and please enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much, Marie. Well, as Marie mentioned, in this first part of the webinar, we will give you an overview on the Electronic Communications Code. And we will touch upon the scope of this legislation, which is a directive. We will explain you the objectives of this legislation, as well as the timelines for the national transposition, meaning the deadline for countries, for EU member states to adapt the national legislation in line with the EU legislation. And we will present you as well with the enforcement of the legislation. We will present you the national regulatory and other competent authorities, as well as the body of the European regulators for electronic communications, what we call Barrack. And without further delay, I'll pass the floor to my colleague Mher, who will start with explaining you the scope. Mher.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I hope everybody can hear me well. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Alejandro mentioned, the first point in the first part of the presentation will be to discuss the scope of the code. But before getting there, I would like to say that today, given the nature of the code, we will use a lot of technical terms, and we will do our best to explain them as easy to understand way as possible. But in case you still didn't understand something, or we forget to explain something, please don't hesitate to ask us. And also, at the end of the presentation, you will find a link to our toolkit, which has a section on definitions. So those terms will also be explained there. So to get to the scope, what the code covers in general are the electronic communication networks. These are basically systems which allow the transfer of signals. So let's say mobile or satellite networks, for example. And they address like a very high capacity networks or 5G, which will be making possible for fast connections, which is something that the EU wants to achieve. And the other things that are included in the scope is the electronic communication services. These are your traditional phone calls, for example, or SMS that you can make, but also web-based services such as Skype or WhatsApp or email communication. It also includes associated facilities, which is basically the infrastructure that is around the for supporting the functioning of the networks and the services. So let's say buildings, antennae, or the towers, etc. And then you have associated services, which can be identity and location present services, or the electronic program guides, which are the menu-based systems that provide users of television, for example, viewers with up-to-date information about the schedule of programs, for example. And then the scope also covers terminal equipment, which are your router or modem or your smartphone, which is connected to the network, and the actors. So the actors are countries, or as in the EU language, we often say member states, national regulatory and other competent bodies. In short, national regulatory authorities are often called NRAs. And also the operators of networks and providers of communication services. Communication services also includes emergency communications, and we will talk about this a bit later. And also what is in the code, again, a term called end users, which also includes consumers, but not only. But for us, it's important to focus on the consumers, and especially consumers with disabilities. And here I dial back to Alejandro, who will present the objectives of the code.
Thank you very much, Mher. The objectives of the code are to improve the competition among the different electronic communication services, the different telecom companies that you can hire for your own use, for example, to drive innovation. As Mher mentioned, high connectivity 5G, for example, is always on the news lately, to strengthen consumer rights, and I will dive into this point in a moment, and to integrate the European digital single market. You you may know, the European Commission has been working intensively on this aspect in the past years. So the removal of roaming costs, for example, is one example of the recent reforms, and now the code is a next step to kind of boosting this European digital single market that we have. Next slide, please, Mher. Thank you. So more particularly on strengthening consumers' protection, the code aims at ensuring a similar level of protection across the EU, so for all consumers, and greater flexibility and choice for services. So you, for example, can switch from one provider to another more easily, for example. The code also includes affordability measures to facilitate facilitate the affordability of these services and the ability of the availability, sorry, of these services, adequate quality services. Irrespective of your location or your income. And one of the outcomes of the recent reforms in this telecoms market has been the limit on the price of international calls. International calls inside the EU cannot cost over 19 cents per minute, or the SMS 9 cents per minute. I mean, as an international organization from EDF, we can assure you that this was very beneficial, and our bills at the end of the month can prove that. There, as we will see in the second part, there are many provisions when it comes to the protection and the rights of consumers with disabilities to ensure equivalent access and choice of electronic communication services, and we will look into that in more depth in the second part of the webinars, as well as the access to emergency communication and public warning system in the case of a natural disaster or another major emergency in the country, such as, let's say, for example, a virus. No. Next slide. And as for the transposition of the code, which, as we mentioned, it is a directive, a European directive. The directive, as you may know, sets the objectives and the requirements that member states need to ensure at national level, and to do so, they need to either introduce legislation or to adapt existing legislation at national level to make sure that they are in line with the European legislation. And to do so, they should do this transposition before the 21st of December of this year. Although we can expect some delays, I presume. So they need to, as I said, they need to adapt their national legislation in line with the European directive, and they need to do this before as I said, the 21st of December, which is as well the day in which the measures, including the code, will be applied. So this is why it's very important, very timely that we take a look at the toolkit that we provided you with, and to make sure that you activists and everybody engage in national discussions with their governments about this transposition period, to ensure that we have an ambitious and correct transposition of this European directive into national legislation. And back to you, Mher.
Thank you very much. So now I will talk about national enforcement and the bodies that are going to monitor and enforce the regulation at national level. Just a small editorial comment here. It should be actually national regulatory authorities and not enforcement authorities as they are defined in the code. So it's national regulatory authorities, or NRAs. The code mentions that besides national regulatory authorities, countries can also designate other competent authorities. So you have first national regulatory authorities, which in Article 5 of the code, the code gives the main tasks which they will be responsible for. This can be, for example, implementing market regulation, ensuring tariff transparency, or contributing to the protection of consumers' rights. But also the code says that the countries can go beyond this. So this is a minimum list of tasks, and countries can designate more powers and tasks to the national regulatory authorities. And this is important for national advocacy groups, because if you are involved in the negotiations about transposition, you can already mention what specific tasks and mandates you would like national regulatory authorities to have in addition to the ones that are in the code. For example, something useful could be that the National Regulatory Authority has a specific mandate on checking accessibility of electronic communications services, so that access, equivalent access and choice for persons with disabilities is ensured. Other than national regulatory authorities, countries can also designate other authorities, what the code says. These other authorities, the powers that they can have is requesting, requiring internet access and interpersonal communication services to publish information about their tariffs, about the service quality, about any costs and restrictions of use of supplies, terminal equipment, for example. The countries must also ensure that certain requirements are met by services to protect the rights of consumers with disabilities and ensure their equal access to these services. And these kind of requirements can be, again, ensuring that consumers with disabilities take advantage of services on equal terms and conditions, including when it comes to prices, tariffs, and quality of service, as those offered to other consumers, irrespective of any additional cost that the provider might have to face in order to provide the service in an accessible manner. And the last slide for this first part of the webinar is about Barrack, or the Body of European Regulators for Electronic Communications. This is a European kind of level structure, but it is important to know about it because Barrack is advising EU on EU level to the Commission and to other EU bodies on technical aspects, and its role will be very important when, for example, the Commission proposes new legal, makes new legal proposals, including if in the future we have a proposal by the Commission to amend and update the code. So this can seem very far off in the future, but it's already important to get in touch with your national regulatory authorities who are the members of Barrack, so you can raise to them any issues that you have in the currently, what gaps you see in terms of accessibility and your rights as users, so they can then raise your issues at European level. So then when laws are being updated, for example, in the future in Europe, on a European level, your concerns and your issues will be also taken into account. So by this, we finish the first part of our presentation, and we will, as mentioned, we have a quick question and answer session, and then after we will continue.
Thanks, Mher. We actually haven't had any content-related questions coming in, so I suggest we continue. There was just one comment, so maybe you have experienced a slight lagging in the sign language interpreters' videos, but we have now checked with them the connection, so hopefully this will be improved. Actually, there's one question coming in, so I will take this one question, and then I will leave you some more time to think about, maybe digest a little bit the information, and take the rest of the questions in the end. The question is to Alejandro and Mher. Do you know which member states are doing better on the transposition? Can you give 3 of the pioneer member states?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have that information. Member states shall notify the Commission, so the Commission may have more information about it. But based on our past experience with other legislation, member states tend to be late sometimes. So we don't know for sure which countries are advancing on the transposition, but this is why we encourage you to reach out to the relevant minister in your country dealing with digital or telecommunication affairs, and also with the member of Barrack in your country, and try to find out as soon as possible who is leading the reforms at national level to comply with the code.
Okay, thanks, Alejandro. I'll hand back to the speakers then, and looking forward to more questions later.
Okay, so we continue with the second part, which is more focused on the aspects of the code that are specific to persons with disabilities, to ensure that we have equal right to access and also equal choice to different services as persons without disabilities. And in this part of the presentation, we will cover universal service. First, to point out, notice that we have article numbers next to the points that we mentioned. This is just to help you to later, if you would like to refer to the code, to know where to find the relevant parts, because the code is quite a large document and sometimes things can be difficult to find. So for universal services, it will be basically what they are. We will explain what the code obliges them for these, and also what we want to ensure. And then we will cover equal access and choice for persons with disabilities and its relationship with the Accessibility Act, how this comes into play. And again, we will see how the code defines it and what we can achieve further and how to achieve this. And then we will discuss emergency communications and public warnings, which is a very crucial issue, especially now with COVID. We see that these barriers to accessibility of emergency communication and public information is a big problem across Europe. And again, here we will talk about the relevance of the European Accessibility Act, which can really support to implement accessibility for emergency communications. So Alejandro will present the point about universal service and equivalent access and choice to persons with disabilities, and I pass the floor to him.
Thanks, Mher. Yes, we reached the core part of our webinar. So what is it for persons with disabilities in the European Electronic Communications Code, and what we want to achieve as disability movement thanks to this legislation. As Mher mentioned, the code defines the universal services that should be ensured at national level to all consumers, to all end users, and these are the adequate broadband internet access. And the code actually includes an annex in which there are different online services that a consumer should be able to use with this adequate broadband access, such as checking websites for e-government services, search engines like Google, video and audio calls with a standard quality, and so forth. So this is one of the universal services, and the other one is voice communications. And obviously the code also includes other services such as the call to the single European number for emergency communications, the 112, which should be free of charge in your country and when you travel across the EU. In previous legislation, so the code is basically a reform of the previous telecom package from 2009, and in that previous let's say legal framework, there were other services such as the provision of directory service to find telephones that you need, or the provision of public payphones on streets and different places. So these services, according to the code, they can remain. It's up to the member states also to keep them, as well as other potential services that they ensure at national level. So the code broadens the reach of these universal services and leaves up to member states to keep these legacy services. Next slide, please. So the code establishes that consumers should have affordable price to these universal services, so to internet access and voice communications, either at a fixed location, which can be your home, for example, or on the move, depending on the connectivity and so forth. So this equivalent access, and here comes the important bits for persons with disabilities, how to ensure this equivalent access to consumers with disabilities. And for this, we advise you to look at articles 84, 85, and 111, 111. And the aim of the European Disability Forum, when we were discussing the legislation with policymakers, was to ensure the availability and affordability of the services and of the equipment in such a way that we ensure really equivalent access. To do so, and I will divide the services in equipment, so in products and services, the code specifies that consumers must have access to terminal equipment which should be accessible for them. And here we are talking about mainstream technologies, so mainstream devices such as, for example, a smartphone or a computer, which are accessible for persons with disabilities. But also, and this is very important, the code makes reference of specialized equipment or equipment which is specialized for persons with disabilities. And here we are talking about assistive technologies, such as augmented and alternative communication means for people with intellectual disabilities or with speech disabilities. We're talking about screen readers to be able to use the computer. We are talking about different technology that we persons with disabilities use to be able to access products or services in conjunction with other products and interoperable with other services. And talking and moving now to services, when it comes to how to make electronic communications accessible for persons with disabilities, what we aim at ensuring at national level and across the EU is to ensure that persons with disabilities have access to total conversation and total conversation services and real-time text. And what is this? For those who don't know, total conversation is a multimedia mode of communication in which you have video, you have audio, and you have real-time text all in the same call. So think of, for instance, a person who is hard of hearing and may prefer the person that he or she is calling to reply by text at the same time that the person with a disability can respond by speech, for example. So total conversation allows the communication in such a way in which users can make use of the video, audio, and real-time text at the same time. And real-time text is a system in which the text that you are typing is being sent as you type. So it instead of finishing the sentence, for example, or the message and press send, the message is being sent character by character. So it gives you the perception of a real-time conversation by text. That's why it's called real-time text. This is not a utopia, because this is already in place in countries such as the US. And our aim with the European Electronic Communications Code is basically to ensure that everybody with or without a disability have access to total conversation and real-time text across the EU. So anybody, let's say somebody from Portugal, can call by real-time text to a friend in Sweden, for example. So this is the way in which the so-called telephony services would be accessible for persons with disabilities. And we'll talk about the relationship with the Accessibility Act in a moment. On top of this, and there are specialized services for persons with disabilities, what we call relay service, and the code also mentions this. Relay service is basically a service in which a person needs a different mode of communication with another person that is calling. So, for example, think of a deaf person who wants to call his or her doctor, and makes use of relay service, makes use of a sign language interpreter to call the doctor on his or her behalf. So the relay service allows either video, so by sign language obviously, or by text if the person prefers text, to call another person on your behalf. And our aim is to ensure that these services, which are absolutely necessary for persons with disabilities to call other people, are available 24/7 across the EU. Next slide, please. The other objective that we seek in the advocacy during the legislative process of the code was to ensure the affordability of these services for persons with disabilities, because you may think, okay, if why a deaf person needs to pay more because he or she needs to make use of video calls than another person that can just make a regular voice call. So the code allows member states to ensure that affordability measures are put in place in national level, so persons with disabilities do not suffer at the end of the month when paying their bills to access these services. And this should also come when total conversation services or relay services are deployed in the EU. So these costs, these services, relay services, which are more common in the EU, but unfortunately not as much as we would like, do not cost more to the users, to the consumer, than a regular voice call. No? Besides, there is also the possibility for member states to set up special tariffs for persons with disabilities, as some countries have already done, such as, for example, to allow free SMS to deaf consumers, or unlimited internet data, for example. There is equity in terms of the affordability of electronic communications. And finally, and Mher briefly mentioned this before, the code defines end users and consumers slightly differently, and inside end users term, the code includes also non-profit organizations. So one of the recommendations we are giving you in the toolkit is to ensure that DPOs which need these special tariffs can apply to them and can actually ensure that they have affordable and available electronic communications services for them. So there is this possibility as well. Next slide, please. And here we come to the core article of the code, Article 111, easy to remember. Is the equivalent access and choice for end users with disabilities. And in this article, the code sets out the requirements or the objectives that member states should ensure this equal access and choice to electronic communication services. And one of the key, let's say, the key aspects that you need to bear in mind when you discuss with your government at national level is that the Accessibility Act, which we will also prepare a toolkit and a webinar for you in the coming weeks. The Accessibility Act provides accessibility requirements to electronic communications products and services. So the Act basically gives those accessibility requirements to ensure that how to design the device. So for instance, a smartphone and the service, the electronic communication service, in order to be accessible for persons with disabilities. And there you will see in the Accessibility Act that real-time text is mentioned, total conversation is mentioned, and so forth. So member states, when they may want during the transposition of the electronic communications code to take into account the requirements of the Accessibility Act in order to let's say, to save or advance work that is on the pipeline and that is coming. So it's very important for you to bear this in mind when you discuss with your national governments, that accessibility requirements, when it comes to accessibility, not to availability or affordability measures, when it comes to accessibility, it's very important to look at the Accessibility Act in conjunction with the code. And obviously, when it comes to choice, so equal choice to the undertakings, to the services in national levels, countries can also adopt measures to ensure that end users with disabilities enjoy the same choice as their non-disabled peers. Next slide. So as I mentioned already, sorry, I kind of went a bit in advance. The Accessibility Act, again, will give you those accessibility requirements for the services and the products for electronic communications, as well as this interoperability objective that we mention very often in the toolkit. And thanks to the Accessibility Act and the future standards and technical specifications derived of the Accessibility Act, we aim at ensuring that everybody in Europe, everybody in the EU will be able to call anybody by real-time text or by total conversation. So like SMS or voice calls that you can call anybody in the world, we want these services to be interoperable as well. We want to be able to call on equal basis with others. So it's very important to bear in mind that we are not calling for special apps or special solutions just for persons with disabilities. Those special services, the relay services, are a different thing. Here we are talking about total conversation and real-time text that we want to be interoperable across Europe, and we want to be also interoperable with emergency communications, as Mher will explain in a moment. And then when you discuss with your government, they may say, okay, but how we do it? How do we do it technically? Tell me. So we know that the Accessibility Act, from the Accessibility Act, the Commission and the standards bodies will develop standards that will be that will provide presumption of conformity, meaning that by complying with those standards, manufacturers or service providers will be able to say, okay, we comply with the legislation. So this is what we call harmonized standards. And the most updated standard that we have that covers accessibility to information and communication technologies is the European standard EN 301549. You have the reference in the toolkit as well with the link, and it's very important that you check that the one that you are providing to your government is the last version, which was adopted last year, is version 3.1.1, because this is the most updated version that we have until, as I said before, we have the harmonized standards for the Accessibility Act. So if they ask you for technical document to start deploying the technology and to start requesting accessibility to providers and to manufacturers, you can mention this this standard, this European standard, which is, by the way, the standard for the Web Accessibility Directive. But here we are talking about ICT with communication purposes, and this standard has chapters which are very, very relevant for the quality and the accessibility of the services that we are talking today. Next. And back to you, Mher.
Yes, from here I will take on the points on emergency communications and public warnings. So as we mentioned, the code also includes this as a very important aspect of electronic communications. First, I will talk about what the code already ensures. So the code obliges that countries ensure that everyone, including persons with disabilities, have access to emergency services free of charge by the single European emergency number 112. So anybody that calls 112 in any country in the EU, they can reach this emergency number. But also countries have to ensure that this access and free of charge access is also ensured by national emergency numbers that countries will determine for themselves. Just a quick point that the article that covers emergency communications is Article 109. Countries must ensure that all emergency communications through the number 112 is possible at least with the same level of speed and efficiency as they do with their national emergency numbers. And when persons with disabilities travel between different EU countries, they should have equivalent access to the 112 number, if possible, without pre-registration. This is what the code says. And the task that this task of ensuring equivalent access to 112 is put on the national regulatory and other bodies, but also the Commission has the function to also support this, especially when people are on the move between different countries. Countries must also ensure that public warnings on emergencies and disasters are transmitted by providers of mobile service communication services to the concerned persons, and this is a separate article, which is number 110. And in addition, countries may decide to transmit public warnings through other services, for example, through mobile apps that rely on internet service, for example. So what we want to see at national level are the following. That we say that national rules should specify that the public safety answering points, which are basically the call centers that respond and handle the emergency calls, and shortly they're called PSAPs, that they comply with the accessibility requirements for PSAPs that are laid down in the European Accessibility Act. Alejandro already mentioned about the Accessibility Act requirements. I'll have to again note, just to be clear, that the Accessibility Act is still not applied in countries. The Act still needs to go through the same transposition process as the code, and the obligations on the PSAPs for complying with accessibility requirements of the Accessibility Act, they do not have to be ensured by countries until June 2027. So, but the text is already published in online of the Accessibility Act, and you can, if governments go on, or the authorities go on the website of the EU journal, they can see the text, so they can see what requirements the Act has, and also so they can already start to think how this will be implemented, and they don't actually have to wait until 2027. They can do this much sooner. It's just like this is the final deadline. So just bring this up in your conversations with them, because only by complying with the Act, this will ensure that the PSAP communication is accessible. What we also want to see is that no pre-registration is required to access emergency communications when traveling between countries, because person safety is the most highest priority, and you should not rely on administrative provisions to ensure this. And also that you should stress to your governments and your national authorities that they should have a harmonized approach to emergency communications, so a person with disabilities can contact the 112 emergency number on equal basis with others in their countries or when they are traveling across the EU. And this can only be achieved if member states or EU countries and electronic communications operators comply with the same accessibility and interoperability requirements when it comes to emergency communication. And we already mentioned, for example, real-time text and total conversation services, for example. And already Alejandro mentioned the European standard on accessibility of ICT products and services, so I will not discuss it again. I mean, you heard. This is a technical document that they can refer to ensure this that the harmonized approach is across the countries implemented. Next slide is again continuing on what we would like to see at national level. National rules should also specify that the 112 number should be possible to contact via relay service at all times, because of course you cannot plan your emergency. Let's say the relay service doesn't work on the weekend. You decide I will have the emergency only on Monday. So we think this time limits are quite ridiculous. They shouldn't be. Public warning systems and emergency information are accessible by more than one sensory channel. For example, the person gets the message through text and also audio, and the messages should be easy to understand, and also with clear, they should be clear behavioral instructions on what to do during an emergency. And we want all these obligations that are stated for the European single European emergency number 112 to be extended to national emergency numbers. But also there are two hotlines which persons can contact. One is missing children, and the other is a child helpline for children who are in difficult situations or emergency situations, who they can contact, for example. And we want these numbers also to comply with the same accessibility requirements. So the third slide on what we want to see at national level implemented is we would like to see that the advanced mobile location or AML system for calls and text to single European emergency number 112 and national emergency numbers is applied. This AML system basically, excuse me, allows fast and accurate caller location information in times of emergency, and is already being implemented in around, I think, 15 EU countries, and some are also starting to implement it. So there will be more countries that implement. And there is also this, what is called Next Generation 112, which is a system that enables high quality, accessible emergency communication using real-time text and total conversation services over the internet protocol. So this is even more efficient and fast way of communicating to emergency services. So we would also like to see this deployed. This is more of a long-term goal, I think, but countries should already start to think about this if they haven't yet. And coming to our last slide for today is our final recommendations, which you can also find in the toolkit we mentioned, is that you should act now, because the process is already going on. Many countries are already doing the transposition. The deadline for member states is December 2020. Maybe due to the current COVID situations, things have slowed down, or we expect that often it happens that countries miss this deadline. So you could take actually this as kind of a maybe a benefit to your side. And if you haven't had the chance to get involved yet, just try to get in contact. You can raise already also awareness among persons with disabilities about the code, because many people will find it quite difficult to understand the benefit of the code, because it's quite technical, but its implications practically for many persons with disabilities are going to be very, very important. And you can also inform the general public, including dialogue with electronic communication services providers. You can present them your access requirements as consumers. You can be in contact with national members of the European Consumer Organization, which is called BEUC. We have the contact details also in the toolkit, and other relevant stakeholders. Again, you will find contact information. So it's good to kind of have at the national level coalition and a comprehensive approach to raise your demands to your authorities for national campaigning and advocacy. And also, again, we emphasize that it's important to raise awareness about the European Accessibility Act, because it's coming. It has to be applied in a few years, and the countries can already kind of have a heads up and start to prepare for its effective implementation to support the code also. Okay, so I think we're done with the presentations and we can start taking questions.
Yes, thanks a lot, Mher and Alejandro. A lot of information to process, but we received also quite a few really interesting questions. I will start from the top, but I had just one quick clarification question of a participant who wanted to know the date that you mentioned in slide 22. If you could just repeat that, because it is not written in the slide. If you could just say that for clarification. And so the first question I received is whether the code is really a minimum directive or if it is actually a full harmonization directive. Could one of you answer that question, please?
I can take, yeah, and then if Alejandro, you want to add. Well, generally, as directives generally don't, they set the goals, as Alejandro already mentioned, for countries to reach them, but they leave some freedom to countries. When it comes to the rights of consumers and other end users, for example, DPOs, this part of the code does aim for full harmonization as much as possible. So it states that what the code aims is to have a very harmonized, equal approach across the EU. So it does not give too many freedoms to member states, but it still, in some provisions, when member states can go beyond, it does state them explicitly. And we have this mentioned in our toolkit. So when you read the toolkit, whenever that we see the possibility of advancing some of the requirements of the code, we highlight this in the toolkit. So yes, it's to answer shortly, generally for consumers, it is a more full harmonization directive, but there are still some things that can be advanced.
And the date that you asked, Marie, was the 21st of December of this year.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect. I think that was a very clear answer. The next question I have is about so the actual advocacy level work on the advocacy work on national level. For national NGOs, the first step would be to get in touch with the national regulatory authorities if they want to start advocating during the period of transposition. So taking into account that the deadline is the end of December, is it not too late to start engaging in advocacy?
Well, it really depends on what states the country is when it comes to transposition, but the national authority is a good way into the discussion, and the authority can point at the relevant policymaker, the relevant ministry in charge of the transposition. So we don't know for sure how late it is. The deadline is what it is December this year, but this is why we need to act as soon as possible.
Okay, perfect, Alejandro. I have actually two questions that relate to emergency communication, so I will maybe put these together. Maybe they have already been answered, but you can maybe summarize. So the first question was on that topic, what and where is accessible crisis communication included? And also a follow-up to this is, what do we do when the emergency number 112 is not available 24/7? Are there strict EU rules? If maybe Mher, you I think had these slides, if you could maybe answer these two questions.
Yeah, I can. So if I get the first question correct, it's just to know where the provisions are. It is in the code, the provisions about electronic emergency communications. It's articles 109, but also about public warnings, it's article 1110. So and the second question about the availability of accessibility of emergency communications all the time. Yeah, this is one of the things that we also mentioned in our toolkit for advocacy, is to make sure that member states ensure that, for example, relay services, they are available all the time. In different countries, you have really different picture depending on the country. Sometimes they're available, let's say, from, I don't know, morning to sometime in the evening. Sometimes they're not available during the weekend. You know, so there's really a different way countries do this at national level, and what we want is, first of all, to make them to have these services all the time without interruption, especially because this is about emergency and it's never planned. And also to have the same conditions in all countries. So whenever a person travels to another country, they might not necessarily be familiar with the conditions in another country. So we want this same conditions everywhere, so people don't have to face these kind of issues when they travel.
Yeah, because if I may, the sad truth is that 112 is available 24/7 for everybody, but for persons with disabilities, because if you cannot call, you are at your own. So that's why we want to push for the provisions of the Accessibility Act to be to ensure that the call center that responds these emergency calls to 112 can do it in an accessible manner. So you can text them, for example, using real-time text, or you can have a video call, a total conversation call with them. And as Mher mentioned, what we need to ensure as well is the possibility to call 112 using relay service that you can use for 112 or for any other thing, but they need to be available 24/7, as telephony services are available to non-disabled people 24/7.
Yeah, I think that was a clear answer. Maybe Alejandro, as you are already were already speaking, I have another question which is quite up to date because it relates to video conferencing services and platforms. Here the specific mention is Zoom, but I think this might also apply to other platforms. So as far as I know, Zoom has been asking to pay extra for captioning. It is like asking people in wheelchairs to pay for ramps. Will this code help to avoid such paid services? Or will Zoom still have the right to demand for extra payment for accessibility? And how is the affordability for captioning, for example, being calculated according to the code?
Well, here there are different aspects. Well, Zoom is a private service. It's obviously electronic communication means, as this platform that we are using today, GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar, sorry. But we need to distinguish between, let's say, the public service and the private service, meaning that if the country decides, for example, to use Zoom or GoToMeeting for the relay service, so as we are having today sign language interpretation and real-time captioning, so the country decides to have this one of these platforms for their relay services, they can do it, and they will need to bear the cost. But for the, let's say, particular use of these platforms, unfortunately, you will need, if you want accessibility and you don't want the automatically generated captions, you will need to pay for it. So this is a private service. We are talking about universal services.
Okay, I think that was very clear. So there was also, you mentioned standards that are related to this directive. So the question here is, when are these EU standards going to be approved? Do you have a timeline?
No, we don't have it yet. I mean, there is a deadline, which I don't remember from the tip of my. I don't remember right now the deadline for the Accessibility Act standard, but it's in the directive. We can get back to you with the deadline. But in the Accessibility Act text, you can see there is a deadline for the Commission to issue the standardization request. And then the standard development will start, and as we know, it may take some time, but as we say in the toolkit, in the meantime, we can make use of the latest version of the EN 301-549, which is very updating, and I would say that is the most advanced e-accessibility standard worldwide. So we can make use of that until we have the standards for the Act.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Alejandro. So maybe for Mher, I have two questions which I can also put together because they're both about advocacy. So the first part of the question is in general. So if your organization has to prioritize and has only space to advocate for one or two changes or additions to the text, what should they focus on? That is the general question. And there is another one which is a more specific. They're asking also for advocacy, so for real-time text total conversation and non-app-based relay services to become reality, should the first step be to advocate for a general shift from telephony-based services to internet protocol? And what about areas in the EU where internet is not available, for example, in rural areas? Do you have any advice on these two questions, Mher?
Well, the first one, I would say, I mean, in terms of urgency, I think emergency communications is a very high priority that should be for NGOs. So that's Article 109. And if you can ensure that emergency communications are accessible and all the services that make these communications accessible are in place 24/7 without interruption, then I think that will already be a big achievement. Another, I don't know, maybe Alejandro, you have another idea, but I can just reply before that to the second question, maybe partially, just to mention that the code also has a provision, which is Article 86, which says that the countries have to ensure that also persons who are located in peripheral regions of Europe or in rural areas, they should also have the services available to them. So it does foresee this. But of course, what will be done at national level, I think then it might be, I don't know how effective it will be, but this is what we try to ensure. So I don't know if Alejandro wants to add, because I think
I would just add that when it comes to these services that we are discussing today, like real-time text or total conversation, relay services, I mean, it will be very important to have good connectivity, and this is one of the objectives of the code. And this is why as well we mentioned the next generation 112 as a new way to call the 112 number instead of by regular calls. So it will be over the internet protocol, so you will be able to call by using the data and hopefully 5G. So with that, you will ensure the quality of the video, which is very important to have a proper sign language conversation, for example, and also to ensure that the robustness of the call. So that's why it's very important to push for also for the, let's say, the infrastructure side of it as well. So we want to ensure that the quality of these services for persons with disabilities, and to do so, we need to also to have the structure, the infrastructure, sorry, to be able to have them.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that answer. We only have a couple of questions left, and I suggest we take these last questions, but any other questions that might come in from now, we will have to take them remotely and answer them later in writing, because we're running out of time. So the last couple of questions. So there's one which again is very up to date at the moment. It is about the corona tracing apps that are being developed at the moment. And the questioner asks specifically about the Netherlands, where they are planning to create a tracking app which tracks you, where you're going, and your contacts when you get the virus. So these contacts will then be tested. I think the concept most of us are familiar with. It seems that so in the Netherlands that Parliament and public opinion focus mainly on data safety and security and not on accessibility. So to try to convince the government and people to follow WCAG 2.1 and the EN 301.549, but most of the app developers do not know it. Is there anything else that you can advise how what to do? And the situation might be the same in other countries as well.
Well, I think the question already answered itself. We cannot do their job. I mean, they need to follow the standards, and that are also kind of referred to or needed to comply with legislation. And we have the directive on web accessibility, the Web Accessibility Directive, that ensures that public websites and mobile applications, and I believe this tracking app will be publicly owned, I hope, will need to comply with the accessibility requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive, and therefore with the standards that that he or she mentioned in the question. So if they don't comply with those, I guess the DPO will need to seek remedy at court or any other means at national level, but they must they must follow these standards.
Okay, that is at least some positive news in all the crisis here. We have one question which is about the application outside the EU. Obviously, the directive is EU legislation, but so here the question is, can you extend to help implement the laws and facilities outside the EU? Can you give maybe a short comment on that?
Well, the ideal scenario would be that we are able to call anybody in the US as well, or in Australia, or in Norway, or in South Africa, or in South America by using real-time text and total conversation. So that is only possible if we aligned our legislation as we are doing in Europe, because this standard that we are mentioning so many times, the EN 301-549, is very aligned with the standard in the US, which is Section 508 and the guidelines 255. Well, it doesn't matter. In the end, we are aiming at ensuring that at international level, we all use the same kind of language for technology to be able to communicate in a smoothly manner. So this is what we are aiming for. But first, we need to get our house in order, let's say, and we should be able to call ourselves in accessible manner.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. And maybe maybe one last question for Mher. So you mentioned several times the connection to the Accessibility Act and also the work that EDF is doing on that. So we can put these two questions together. So one is, when is the webinar on the European Accessibility Act? And the second one on the same topic is their connections with the Accessibility Act, and you are also preparing a toolkit. And the preparation for national transposition is about to start in our country. When do you plan to launch this toolkit? So maybe Mher, you can take this one.
I think we planned the webinar in October or September, if I'm not mistaken. I can check again when it's in our work plan and reply if it's really you need a specific answer. And with the toolkit, it should be as soon as possible. It's just that sometimes with other urgent matters coming up, we have not yet been able to publish. We should have already done that, but hopefully in the next couple of months, the latest, it will be published.
Great. So the last question for today. So thank you very much for all your really interesting contributions. This will be the last one. I'll leave it up to you, Alejandro Mher, who wants to take it. So you mentioned a date for the PSAPs to comply with the European Accessibility Act and the code. So where does it say that it is 2027, in the code or in the act? And in which article?
Yeah, it's in the Accessibility Act. So I think it's there is a point on Article 4.8 which talks about the accessibility of the emergency number 112. But then at the very last part of the Accessibility Act text, where you talk about the transitional measures, there is a specific point which says that this provision about the accessibility of 112 can be an exception, and countries can decide to apply it later, and the deadline for this is given, I think, June 2027. So it's in the Accessibility Act text.
Great, thank you very much. And this is the end of the webinar. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time, but I hope you found it interesting. For any follow-up questions, obviously you will find the contact details in the last slide and also in the handouts. I want to thank very much our speakers, obviously today, Alejandro and Mher, but also the sign language interpreters, the captioner, obviously, and finally also Raquel, our organizer, who is now on her 4th webinar today. So it was a long day. Thank you very much for all your help and support, and we hope to see you again next time in one of our webinars. Have a nice day.
Thank you.